Hi, Bill.
Hey, Bob.
Thank you for doing this.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
I appreciate you coming out to visit with us today. You are our first and probably only repeat guest.
Well, that's probably because it was fun to be here last time.
Well, it's probably because you're a glutton for punishment.
Maybe some of that.
For those that might be watching that don't know your background, I would encourage them to go back and look at our very first interview. It's actually our very first interview ever. And we spent some time talking about your background, how you went through the Fed and got to be with the University of Houston. I encourage everyone to go look that video up, that interview up, and learn some more about Bill and his incredible career. For those of you that don't have time to do that, I would simply say that this is Dr. Bill Gilmer, and he's director of the Institute for Regional Forecasting at the Bauer College of Business at the University of Houston. And Bill, it's great to have you here. We're going to visit a little bit about some of the stuff we talked about then, but we're going to dive into some deeper elements, I think, as well.
Good.
If we go back and I'd like to start with back at that time when we were talking about economic conditions for 2018. I'd like to go back to 2018 a little bit briefly, and if you could just kind of take us from 2018 all the way through early 2019, which I think has been described as a mildly robust economy.
Yeah.
And then from there, from early 2019 until now, we've slowed down a bit. If you could take us briefly back through that time and maybe explain some of the dynamics that we've been looking at.
Well, if you go back to, say, this time in 2018, things were good here in Houston. Things were good across the country. They were very good. We'd just come off of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It was passed in late 2017. It was a late cycle stimulus package, some significant tax cuts, both corporate tax cuts and individual tax cuts that were built into that. And it really carried into 2018. The economy was doing extraordinarily well. And the U.S. economy was growing fast enough. The Federal Reserve was concerned because labor markets were tight. Inflation looked like it was going to try to pick up a little bit. And so the Fed, during much of 2018, was raising interest rates. And
Right.
December, late in the year, they finally paused on those increases. In terms of the oil industry that's so important here in Houston, this time last year, oil was about $70 a barrel. OPEC had teamed up with the Russians late in 2017, early in 2018, so you had two of the biggest oil producers in the world, the U.S. being the third, and they had agreed to support prices jointly. Now, whether the Russians really did is a matter of debate, but
Right.
the Saudis had managed to keep prices high with the help of a strong global economy and national economy at the time. And if you look what happened in Houston, we generated probably over 70,000 jobs, well above trend. And Houston was doing well this time last year. This year, we've slowed down a bit. There's no question. A combination of lower oil prices, a bit of a credit crunch in oil as well, a slowdown in the national economy. The national economy is not struggling, but it did slow down. And I think it was widely anticipated. But that slowdown has happened, and that's spilled into Houston. So the two big things that make Houston work are, one, the national economy, and two, oil prices. And there you are. They're both not doing as well as last year. So we're probably, I would guess, around 60,000 jobs this year, which is just below trend. Houston's long-term average growth has been right at 2%. We've got 3.2 million workers here, so that's going to be 64,000 would be trend growth. And so right now, I'd say we're sitting right on moderate growth, around 60,000
Okay.
jobs. Yeah.
Okay.
And have been now for a couple of years.
When we look at that critical marker for our economy, which is the price of crude oil, a barrel of crude oil, you had already mentioned that we were sitting around early 2018, the mid-60s, latter 2018, up to upwards of 70. Now in 2019, we're looking at the mid-50s. If you look at that, and now we look forward a little bit to 2020, is there a price point that we think, a range that we think the oil and gas industry might be targeting for the purposes of their spending plans and budgets and that kind of thing?
Well, OPEC in 2014 made a deliberate decision to slash the price of oil. They looked at the growth of the fracking industry in the U.S., and this was an effort to kill it in the cradle before it got any bigger. And they pushed the price of oil down to $30 a barrel. And briefly, drilling in the U.S. went to the lowest levels that we have ever seen, down to 404 working rigs in the U.S. And it looked like they were successful. And in fact, in late 2016, they came back going into 2017, and they basically said, we win. And now we are going to push prices up to the level they should be at.
Declare a victory even though you don't have it.
Well, I'm not sure they really understood at that time that they didn't have it. But by the time we got to the middle of 2017, the price of oil was back at $45 a barrel. American fracking had just taken off again. Our oil surged back onto the market. And, I think if you look at the long experience, then they come back with the Russians, they get the price up for a while. They've learned sort of two lessons in recent years. One, they can't get the price of oil up to $70 a barrel because it just brings American fracking and American production back online. And two, they can't afford the low prices to really kill American fracking the way they like to. And it seems that the strategy they have developed right now is right at $55 a barrel. That's just under sort of the marginal cost of fracking if it's going to grow, if the industry's going to grow in the long run. And they seem to be having some success in using that $55 marker, something they can afford and live with for a while. And the 55 bucks seems to be having an effect this year. Well, there's more than just the price of oil, but this year the rig count has slipped we've dropped about 250 rigs this year.
Okay.
The rig count's down about 25%. We were just over 1,000 rigs in late 2018, so the rig count's down about 25%. And I think we finally have worked our way through the data so we can say that where American oil production was growing just like that from after 2016, it's now begun to slow, and it's growing something like that. It was hard to tell, but the data has to be seasonally adjusted.
Right.
And also we had the polar vortex earlier in the year that shut down a ton of oil production for a month. And then we had hurricanes over the summer, which shut down a ton of production. So the data were kind of like this, but we've finally gotten far enough past weather and seasonally adjust the data, and it just looks like much slower growth now. So that $55 is working for OPEC, and that may be where I'm certain that the producers themselves are aiming for a target like that.
Right.
Now, the other thing that's affecting the industry is a credit crunch. This is an industry, when you think of the oil industry in the old days, we were talking about the Seven Sisters, right? But we're still, as recently as just a decade ago, it was still all about Shell, Exxon, right. BP, these companies that were doing these multi-billion-dollar projects that would last 10 years to bring on huge amounts of oil. And the fracking industry is a group of small producers. They, small companies, freedom of entry. If the oil, the old days of wildcatting is long over. If you drill for oil, you know you're going to find it. So if you set the price of oil at 55 bucks, you just have to look for the spots where you can produce at 5 bucks. But this industry, maybe industry was born during that era of cheap money. Really comes along just about the time the Fed does quantitative easing, and the industry has in recent years been run by, no matter what their title, way too many CFOs.
Right.
And not enough CEOs. But the CFOs were all trying to make a killing on the stock market. It was all about pulling together, impressing the stock market just enough to be able to cash out or merge it with another bigger company for a big payday. And those days, that hasn't worked very well. It just has not worked well. And Wall Street's basically turned its back on these companies.
Yeah, and anecdotally, I can relate to that going back to 2015, 16, and 17. Toward the end of that period of time, senior debt dried up for a lot of that activity, not just in the production side, but also on the industrial services side.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of my clients were finding it hard, and there were banks that were literally announcing in the press and announcing to their, whenever they would go on and give their SEC reporting, they were announcing that they're not going to do any more lending in the oil and gas industry, even banks here in Houston.
Yeah.
And so that was a big tell for me personally to see that attitude here pervade into some banks, and wasn't all of the banks, but it was a good number of them that said, even Wells Fargo, they got drilled pretty hard as well.
Yeah.
So that whole issue of money drying up, it probably started in the senior debt arena, but it quickly spread, as you mentioned, to private equity and into the public markets.
Yeah. Yeah. And there was but it's easy to exaggerate. There was a piece in the Houston Business Journal last week, I guess now, or maybe earlier this week, and the headline is "Second Colossal Wave of Bankruptcy Shaping the Industry." And it turned out that was written by 3 bankruptcy lawyers, which might
Wishful
tell you something.
thinking.
Wishful thinking, yeah, if only. But bankruptcies actually so far this year haven't quite matched what happened in 2018. And I don't remember the exact number of bankruptcies, but it was about like what we've seen so far last year, and it was maybe a third of what happened back in 2016 if you look at producers. And if you look at the service companies, interestingly enough, I think if you took collateralized and uncollateralized debt, last year it was about $7 billion for the service companies and $3 billion the year before. However, what happened this year was one company, and that was Weatherford, the fourth biggest service. 95% of that collateralized and uncollateralized debt for service companies that fell into bankruptcy was Weatherford, who had bet the ranch and lost, basically.
Right. Well, as we look forward into 2020, what should we and the industry be looking at that could either positively or negatively impact prices going forward? What are some of those dynamics and triggers that could affect that price point?
Well, in the very short run, you always have this long list of bad things that can happen. Most recently,
long list, yeah.
Most recently, it's been it can be Venezuela and the collapse of the Venezuelan economy, which is ongoing. That subtracts a significant amount of oil from the world, and so things can spike up. Most recently, it's been Iran, and either the attacks on the Saudi oil fields, attacks on tankers, or bad news. And now all of those things, they'll cause the price to spike up in the short run. But it can just be really bad news on the global economy, a bad IMF report on the outlook for the global economy, for example, and all of a sudden you'll see the price down. And then we'll work through that. And so, at the long run, as you look at the futures curve, and the futures curve, is basically like a forecast of the price of oil from the futures market, where you start today and you can go out to 2024, 2025, and it'll tell you the price of oil every month all the way out, or every quarter at least. And what we see right now is a lot of volatility at the short term but everything goes out to that $53, $54 dollar range. Okay. So, you know, apart from the volatility, we're talking sort of an OPEC forecast from the futures market at this point in time.
So it brings a question, and then I want to lead to another aspect of this whole discussion. But that question really initially is, does OPEC have the kind of sway that it used to have? And I think I read somewhere recently that we're now not the largest, close to the largest oil producer. Yeah. Yeah. So how does that affect OPEC's ability to guide and to dictate market activity? Yeah. But then after we get past that, I want to ask you about the impact on jobs in our Houston region. But let's start with that premise to begin with. How much sway is OPEC going to have?
You know, I think OPEC, after their little fiasco in 2017, where the Saudi minister came back and said, we'll do whatever it takes to keep the price of oil up, and then by the middle of the year, it hadn't worked. And really, it was the Saudi oil minister, the one that counts in that whole arrangement. And I think that's why they went looking for the Russians, because I think they realized they couldn't quite handle this problem by themselves anymore. And you know, if we talk about a recession or a very slow economy even, I think they're going to have a really hard time dealing with that, because that would entail substantial cuts on their part to try to keep the price of oil up. Right. So, and certainly a recession, every time we have a recession in the U.S. or certainly on a global basis, the price of oil is going to plummet, and that would be the big fear on the downside.
So you're killing my stereotype now. You've used the word recession 3 times, and I was under the impression that economists refused to use that word. It's GDP decline, which I haven't quite figured that out yet.
No, we use the word recession.
Well, let's talk about jobs, and particularly in the Houston economy. If I remember right, you put together a potential projection for if we're at the high end of the spectrum of oil and gas prices, if we're at sort of the moderate end was 63,000, 64,000 jobs, and then if we're at the low end, how did this discussion about the price of oil and gas and how it affects our economy, talk a little bit about the real impact to jobs.
Let's just say sort of the medium forecast is for the 55, basically that $55 oil mark, assuming that's what the Saudis really want to do. There's another, the high forecast and is for $85 oil. And let's just put a mark up there way high. It's hard to quite picture what would get us to 85. I used to use $100 oil. I don't use that anymore. Right. But even at $85, it would take some sort of significant disruption to the oil production system for $100 oil to come back. And on the $40 end of it, we could be talking about a recession. That's one possibility. Or OPEC withdraws again and decides to just let the price of oil fall, which I think that's probably fairly unlikely. But what it does for oil prices in Houston, oil employment here in Houston, first let's just talk about 65 to 55, that sort of change that we seem to have made. That's going to entail, if it was at 65 today and we, over the next 12 months, knocked it down to 55, we would be running with about 10,000 fewer oil jobs. That's out of something like 260,000, I think, here in Houston. It's about a 3.5% decline associated with that loss in oil prices. And of course, we do much better. I can't remember the exact numbers. We're going to add 10,000 jobs, 15,000 jobs with the $85 oil. And on the downturn, we lose I think around 15, we lose around 20,000, something like that. Now that's different from what happened, very different from what happened in 2014. Because remember in 2014, we were at $100 oil. We had been at $100 oil for several years. And so with the price of oil going up and up, we were adding jobs in Houston that were built on this $100 marker. And so when it fell, we subtracted 74,000 jobs here in Houston were lost over that 2-year period, and only 30,000 have come back. Now that 30,000, that's probably all we're going to see, and that 30,000 was is now built on $60, $65 oil. So that adjustment to the downside is the 10,000, and taking it to 40 again, we're not at 100. So it's not the kind of big damage that we did to ourselves by going from boom to bust. We're going from a moderate situation to a considerably lower plateau.
Sure.
So it's not as bad, certainly not as bad as what happened in 2014. You know, if it's my job, no, that's really bad. So
Exactly.
just knocking off 10,000 jobs, I don't want to be too cavalier
Right.
about that.
Right.
But
Right.
yeah, it's not the disaster of 2014, 15 again.
We have a subset of the oil and gas market that I want to briefly touch on as well. As I understand it, Houston's now home to about 49% of the total U.S. petrochemical industry. And I also, as I'm hearing, there's currently an oversupply of ethylene and polyethylene product. Does that concern you that we've got an oversupply of a product that we dominate in terms of our this sector of the economy, in light of the fact that we have all these other potential issues like tariffs and downgrading of growth projections and that kind of thing?
Well, I have to say no, yes, but yes, we have some concerns just as a metro area, but probably not for that reason. Now, for the folks that watch this, when we talk about petrochemicals, there's refining, and the refiner's going to take that barrel of oil and he's going to turn it into oil products. And when we talk about petrochemicals, we're talking about taking natural gas and natural gas liquids, propane, butane, ethane. These are natural liquids that are produced along with natural gas, and they fall off when the pressure drops and so on. And they can be produced, they can be turned into plastics. So if we take ethane, it becomes this intermediate product called ethylene. And then as we go down the chain, that becomes polyethylene, which is your plastic water bottle, or it can be polyvinyl chloride, which is, you just add a little bit of chlorine and you have those white pipes under the kitchen sink. And that's what we do. We make plastic in Houston. That ethylene was the big building block on the ship channel. And it was the collapse in natural gas prices back in 2012 when those prices fell. And it makes us and a couple of countries in the Middle East the only ones with this enormous supply of extremely cheap gas in Texas for the most part going forward. Texas and Pennsylvania and New York, if they would allow it to happen. But that kicked off this huge boom here in Houston on the ship channel. It's the way the oil industry works. When things are bad upstream, when the price collapses there, it's good for downstream because that collapse in oil prices and natural gas prices is their feedstock. That's what makes, and they can produce it much cheaper or get their much bigger profit margins. And all of a sudden, Texas becomes this privileged place in terms of natural gas prices, and literally all the European countries, for example, realized the Dutch, the Germans, they couldn't produce plastics unless they relocate here. And so suddenly we had, I think the American Chemistry Council estimated $220 billion in expansions of manufacturing in the US just because the price of natural gas and oil fell when they did. And 50 billion of that landed in Houston. Now, if you take the Texas Tower downtown, I think that big new building that's going up, I think we could put up about 330 of those buildings for $50 billion. So that'll give you some idea of the kind of construction boom that was, excuse me, that was underway on that side of town at the time. The east side of town, while the west side struggled, the east side was in this enormous boom along the ship channel. And that boom has largely come to an end. That $50 billion has been spent. There's still $10 billion in construction, a lot underway. But just as providing momentum from the Houston economy, it's not the $50 billion we enjoyed before. Now the problem going forward, it is the price. When they build these enormous plants, and several of them at a time, it's going to depress the price of the product. It's a very cyclical industry, and when they build these out, they're forced to build them for 30 years of production. But there's a second wave that's coming now, and we're seeing some of that now in the ship channel, because it's anticipated that the price will improve. And you also want to get in front of your competition, right? You want to be the one that enjoys the highest prices, at least for a while. But the problem is that the ship channel is pretty much built out. There's only 3 or 4 pieces of good land left on the ship channel. It's very pricey. And redevelopment of a lot of those places the places that are available are really expensive. The LA Long Beach is going through some of that now, but it's a very expensive process. And so what we're seeing is now Corpus Christi boom. And this huge new Saudi Exxon facility is going in Corpus. And they've sort of become one of the places a lot of work that probably would happen in Houston ever otherwise has landed. And the other one is Lake Charles. For the export of LNG, Lake Charles has become ground zero for that business. And so Houston's still going to see this work. Exxon still has a huge tract of land out there that they can expand on. And the Gulf Coast, up and down the Gulf Coast, there's still a lot of competition in Texas and Louisiana, a lot of places to move, and there's value in diversifying against hurricanes, for example. So there's a lot of work underway, though.
Bill, as we talk about that petrochemical impact to our region, all of these issues affect jobs. Jobs in our region, jobs throughout the United States. In our region, we're projected to add more jobs to the economy than we have human resources to fill. In terms of the midpoint and above, once you get above 60,000 or so jobs created, if I remember right, we talked about this a while back, there really isn't enough local human resource to fill those jobs that are going to be created. So it's got to come from somewhere, but then you look at the national picture, and our unemployment rate sits at about 3.2 or whatever, 3.6, something like that %.
Yeah.
And now our Houston region is starting to mimic those unemployment rates. We're right there in line with them. And so I'm wondering, where would we get people to fill those jobs that are being created? Where would we normally get them in a typical upside or high demand year for us?
Are you talking specifically about construction or just general growth overall?
I think maybe let's talk about both. Construction, it seems like, is an easy answer because it's temporary. It's going to come in, it's going to build it, and then it's going to go.
Yeah.
But on the long term, do you see us being able to fill all of those long-term jobs that are being created in the economy, or do you feel like they're going to be filled by some other states, or they're going to come from immigration, or how do you see that being handled?
Well, right now, in a way, it depends on where we are in the business cycle and how easy it is to draw labor from other places. Now, in 2014 and 2011, just coming out of the the Great Recession, 2011, 12, 13, even in 2014, Houston was booming, right? But if you looked at the rest of the country, it was just beginning to get over the Great Recession. It took a long time, and you can't really blame anybody for that, because once you have a financial crisis, subdued growth is the norm.
Right.
Normally you think if you just have a garden variety recession, you should make a quick recovery, bring the labor back, the factories are already there. But with the financial crisis, it took a long time. And we had that labor available. And in fact, in each one of those years, we had 100,000 people moving to Houston as in-migrants. Along with we had 100,000 new jobs open each of those years, and then they came in. Now, over the last couple of years here in Houston, 2017 and 18, domestic migrations turned negative in Houston. We're actually seeing more people leave here than come in. And it is partly a matter of competition with the rest of the country, because we're looking at an unemployment rate that's 3.6% in Houston now. Now that we've come back, we're pretty much almost exactly at the same place as the rest of the country. And the rest of the country is at, well, the last time we saw 3.6% was sometime in the 1960s. So the demand for labor is very, very strong. And it's very, very tight. You can, walk around any mall or store to store. And I was in Chicago recently, and every store had a sign on the front door that said, "We need help, please come in, fill out an application," and that's true here in Houston as well. So the in-migration's not going to help us out much this time around, because it's really very tight everywhere. And so apart from that, we're not, demographics is working against us, and so we're just talking about slower growth. We're not going to be able to do as much as we want. If you talk about construction on a national basis, and you look at what's happening to the construction market, we have something like 300,000 job openings, and maybe turnover is so small right now in the industry, you might see 50,000 people available to fill those jobs. So, and as a result, we're looking at wages that actually are rising very, very quickly. Well, not very, very quickly, but they're rising quickly. What was a prolonged period of low wages has become rapidly increasing wages, and not just at the top of the ladder, not just at the top of the income ladder, across the board. Low income, those signs on most of those shop doors aren't looking for high wage employees. Right. And across all ethnic and racial groups as well. So this is a very general increase in wages, but we're kind of up against it in that department. Right,
and so that also makes me curious about nationally, our competitive position nationally, as you mentioned, but also as a U.S. economy. So up in Seattle, Washington, I can have a fair amount of visibility on the same thing. You were just in Chicago. I spend a fair amount of time in the Seattle area, and I can tell you that the lack of skilled and unskilled labor force there is sort of at a critical point. It's hard to get the services rendered that you need to get service, and then everything is months to get it done, or months to fill a job, or it's extraordinarily expensive to get something done. When you compare our price points for some of the services and products that we have here, you compare those to the Seattle, Washington area, it's extremely expensive in that region. And so Amazon's going around the country recruiting to bring people back into the Seattle area to work. So as you mentioned, there's a lot of competition. So and you sort of alluded to this a minute ago, but maybe if we could sort of expand a little bit on that, isn't it a drag on the economy overall if over an extended period of time you have job creation opportunity with growth projections at a certain rate and you can't fill those jobs? Doesn't that also create a drag in and of itself?
It does, and we're right on the cusp of having to recognize that we're not going to grow as fast. It takes labor and it takes capital. And if we have not grown as fast, and the result is that as the baby boom generation retires, that retirement gives us a large number of folks who are going to be falling out of the labor force in a hurry. And we don't have a baby boom on the other end that's coming along. We do have sort of a boomlet in the millennials. There was a sort of a second wave that came through.
Right.
But there's nothing to replace what we have lost in terms of the retirement of the baby boom generation, just in terms of sheer numbers. And the answer is slower growth in front of us. We're not going to be talking about even 2% GDP. If you look at the numbers from the Congressional Budget Office for budgeting purposes, they're way below 2%. And it's just pure demographics. Short of migration, immigration, there's not much we can do about it.
Right, and so sort of to your point, U.S. GDP growth for 2019 was expected to come in somewhere around 2.3%.
2019 probably is going to come in right at 2%.
Okay.
2020, I'm sorry, yeah, 2020.
1.7, 1.9,
yeah,
somewhere in that range. So as we look at that, and there's some good news in that was growth, right? It's GDP growth.
Yeah.
But there's also maybe some not so good news, which we talked about on the labor side of that.
Yeah.
What are some other things that you feel like are, potential things to watch out for because we're at 1.7 to 1.9%?
Well, one of the interesting things right now is the fact that the Federal Reserve paused in December of last year, and they said there's no threat from inflation. And that's continued to be true. There is no. So here we're talking about the incredibly tight labor markets, rising wages, and what happened to inflation?
Where's the money?
Where's the money? And I think there might be an interesting parallel with what's going on. The Federal Reserve has cut rates 3 times in the face of this tight labor market, rising wage situation. And if you go back, we know the global economy is really struggling, especially in Europe. Growth's down substantially. And if you go back to 1997, a long time ago, that was the Asian financial crisis. And what happened in 97 was a financial crisis that broke out in Southwest Asia, spreads to all of Asia, to Russia, mainly Scandinavian countries and Europe. And really, the price of oil plunges in Houston and around the world. And the Greenspan Fed says, at the Times was saying, the economy's really tight. We really need to be raising prices, and they were raising rates, and they were raising rates. And then, but they had always, the history was up until 97, the global economy doesn't count. We have few international ties to the rest of the world. We just run our own domestic policy and mind our own business. But the Greenspan Fed said, for the first time, we've developed global ties. And if the rest of the world is sinking rapidly, we don't have to worry about inflation. Inflation is not on the horizon and not a problem. And so they reversed course and began cutting rates to support the rest of the world and to try to become an engine of growth for the rest of the world. And I think there's some parallels maybe with what's going on now as we don't see inflation despite the market being as tight as it is here, because we're able to import so much from abroad that at cheaper rates than would normally be the case. For example, the price of wallboard, Canadian lumber, the prices are down sharply this year, for example. So you can kind of see this global weakness or Well, that may have been some Fed raising rates earlier in the year too. But still, there's a very nice parallel there that may be underway right now. That's not a long-term fix for anything, unfortunately,
right.
because as soon as the global economy picks back up, and we hope it does, then inflation might be back again at some point.
I want to go further into that sort of global situation, but before we leave this particular discussion, I'd like to get your thoughts, if you have anything you'd like to share about why it is that our Houston regional economy is so important to the rest of the United States.
Yeah.
We play a role, we're sort of the lifeblood, if you will. If you think about oil and gas as being sort of the bloodline that runs through the veins of the country, we really kind of drive that. And I'm curious to know or to hear your thoughts about why our economy here might be so important to the rest of the U.S. economy overall.
Yeah. Well, these clusters form around high concentrations of skilled workers, and then suppliers, and you wind up with the oil service companies all located here. Howard Hughes invents the rotary bit right here in Houston and comes to bring his company here. And so, you get an important knowledge loop that forms both in terms of, for all of these skills, there's usually some sort of professional association that goes with it. And then, probably the CEOs all playing golf at River Oaks, and probably the most important knowledge loop of all. So, and that's common feature to all of these. Then we have our downstream. We don't just have upstream oil here in Houston. It's not just drilling. The downstream, again, formed of 1900, a product of the Galveston storm. It wasn't safe to locate big capital facilities on the coast. And these form, and once they form, they're all producing different things. And you have a chemical reaction, and you have a lot of products you use, and a lot of them you don't use that form as byproducts. But that may be for the next plant over. One man's treasure is another man's trash, or vice versa in this case. Right. And so there's this huge network of pipes that connect all of these facilities all across the Houston region in terms of moving all of these chemical byproducts back and forth and sharing them, and creates tremendous economies among those plants. The medical center with 100,000 workers, and it's not the medical community in Houston that counts. Every place has a medical community. Whether you're in Nashville or New York or wherever, we all have to go to the doctor occasionally. But what sets it apart is this enormous concentration of educational and research facilities in Houston.
Right.
So Houston is really a set of several clusters.
Okay.
And each one of them built on it's really an engineering town in a lot of ways. Even a doctor basically is an engineer. They're not necessarily the research scientist. They're the one that's carrying out a very practical agenda on a day-to-day basis. So Houston's quite an amazing place. And then our situation on the Gulf Coast with the port, for example. 2 million containers now coming, second largest port in the U.S. based on tonnage now. So we have a privileged place. Much of that oil and petrochemicals leaving town, and plastics.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, let's switch gears a little bit and talk for just a minute. The folks that might be watching us will also be keen to look out for trigger points, I think, for 2020. As we end up 2019, as we go into 2020, trigger points that loom ahead potentially that could put us on a path to a recession. Some of those things that if it just goes the wrong way, then we find ourselves into a recession period or some difficulty.
Yeah.
What are some of those kinds of triggers that they might be looking out for?
You know, we're not good at finding those trigger points. We never have been. We know a lot about recessions, but what we know, we usually know from learning about them after the fact. If you look at the surveys, for example, from the Wall Street Journal, they have a quarterly survey of a panel of economists, or the membership of the National Association of Business Economists. They have like a 40 or 50% chance of recession ahead. But what I can tell you is they also, all of those surveys have a box on them that says, I don't know.
Right.
And more of them should learn to check that, should learn to be more humble and check that,
Right.
check that box.
Yeah.
There's it's not exactly the definition of a recession, and that's a little different, but there's a survey of professional economists that's done by the Philadelphia Federal Reserve. I think usually between 30 and 40 professional economists. And the question they ask is, are we going to have a year-over-year decline in GDP? Now that's probably close to a recession. And they have about a 6% chance next year, and then maybe 10% for the couple of years after that. Very, very low. What you see in there is not a recession, but a big slowdown in growth as we move into next year, mostly because of what's happened to world trade and to the global economy, not so much here in Houston. Now there will be another recession at some point. It's sure to happen. We know that. And when it does happen, it's going to come pretty quickly. It usually only takes a quarter or two
Right.
for that recession to land. But let me give you an example of how hard they are to see. Probably the biggest economic staff in the world is at the Federal Reserve Board in Washington. I mean, they have a whole staff looking at every detail. And we had the worst recession in American history up since the Great Recession, since the Great Depression, the worst recession in the financial crisis. And we now know that began in December 2007. And the first inkling of that recession came from the Federal Reserve, who internally began to get very concerned about April and May of 2008.
Oh.
Okay.
A little late, okay.
Yeah, that's that. And then the official call for after, and the NBER makes the official call, but they wait to make sure they don't have to revise much of anything in terms of that data. And so it takes usually a full year before we get an announcement that a recession has started, at least 6 months to a year. And so we're not very good at seeing them land in our lap.
Right.
I can't tell you, I think I can be pretty sure we don't have any signs of one now. If you're looking for a recession, probably the first good sign, and this is from a recent study, I think at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, the best indicator, if we ever see the U.S. unemployment rate jump up by 0.5 percentage point, nobody's announced anything yet, but be careful, there's a good chance we're in a recession.
Okay.
But in terms of trigger points, is it going to be an oil recession? Is it going to be an oil bust or a financial crisis? Right. A tech bust? We always, death by 1,000 cuts.
Right.
We don't really know those things. They just tend to arrive out of the blue. And most economists will tell you they're not forecastable. Those trigger points. I guess most people, if there is one, it would be trade. That trade could be the trigger. I would say a good chance that Europe could be the trigger for a global recession. Germany started with all of their problems with auto emissions.
Right.
It's turned into a manufacturing recession in Germany. Right now, they just announced 0.1% growth in Europe. Italy's the third largest economy in Europe. They are in recession, facing a big budget crisis. They have the third largest debt market in the world. And a debt crisis in Italy is going to mean a European financial crisis, because they hold the debt. Mostly France, Germany, and Brussels hold large amounts of that Italian debt. So if the Italians just decide to have a big haircut on that debt, we're talking European financial crisis for sure, and that would be my main trigger right there is Europe.
Well, that leads
and
us.
Throw in Brexit, by the way.
Yeah. So that leads us into really the thing that I wanted to get into next, which relates to our trade agreement and tariff situation. We seem to be at war with the world. It seems like this administration decided to say, hey, we're not going to play it safe with anybody. We're just going to go be confrontational with everybody.
Yeah.
So starting with China, because we've talked about that quite a bit, what I'm seeing and hearing, what I believe you had presented even at a recent symposium, is that if tariffs are expanded beyond where they are now, which they're threatened, just this week they were threatened again to be expanded. The IMF projects a drop in 2020 GDP for the U.S. of 0.66%. That sounds like people hear that, it's a 0.66%, okay, that's nothing. But when you juxtapose that against, we're really talking about 1.7 or 1.9% GDP growth, you're talking about cutting 35 to 40% of your growth right out of the mix if you expand these tariffs and they have any kind of prolonged impact. And then they're also saying the same thing about China, that it'll be about 33% or so of their GDP growth projections will also be hurt.
Yeah. Now, not next year. That's over the long run.
That's over the long run.
Yeah.
And so, as we look at those impacts, as the two of the largest economies in the world start to see a hit, and we look at the impacts of that start to wind through the world economic system, could that be the thing that pushes Europe, for instance, over the threshold and into a recession?
Yeah. Well, a lot of people are pointing to what's happening in Germany, for example, right now, as they'd like to characterize themselves as the innocent bystander in this trade dispute, the people who just happen to get hurt. But Germany, 49%, I believe, of Germany's GDP is from trade. So they are extremely sensitive to trade. Europe's well over 20%. I don't recall. I think it's the high 20s for Europe as a whole in terms of sensitivity to trade.
Right.
And they're not, well, they have been affected themselves. Europe was affected early on by the aluminum and steel tariffs. Right. Now, those weren't directed to Europe, they were just directed to everybody, and Europe happened to get in the way. And recently, just for the heck of it, we threw in wine and cheese as another set of $7.5 billion.
$7.5 billion, supposedly the largest tariff ever approved by the World Trade Organization or something like that?
Yeah. Now, the innocent bystander story kind of goes away there, because that was punitive tariffs that the U.S. was allowed to implement because of Airbus.
Right.
And for 15 years of cheating on and providing subsidies to Airbus, finally went to arbitration, and the WTO said, have $7.5 billion. Tariff, I think if I understand it right, Europe basically agreed to make sure they didn't do that in the future. And these tariffs were, well, that's great. What about that $7.5 billion that got lost along the way? We'll just collect it in wine, cheese, and olives.
Right. As you look at that, as you look at the European situation, are we currently negotiating an agreement, trade agreements are our peace accords. When we talk about it in terms of war terms, right?
Yeah.
Trade agreements are our peace accords. Tariffs are the bombs that we drop.
Yeah.
And so when we look at the U.S.-Europe relationship, are we currently negotiating for an additional trade agreement or an amendment to a trade agreement? Are we out there trying to work this out with them?
Well, I think our real estate developer president is trying to put the stake out there, right, to get one. But the response so far has been that we don't negotiate with a gun to our head. And the French are saying we don't negotiate unless the Paris Climate Accords you're not a member, so we can't negotiate with you. Now the Japanese have been more accommodative, and the Japanese have, I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but it's something like $50 billion in agricultural benefit to the U.S. from tariffs that they have reduced. Now I think the big sticking point, both in Japan and Europe, is automobiles. The tariff that we're hanging over their heads, and this is the gun to their heads in both cases, is automobiles. And you can see from the discussion we just had about German manufacturing how sensitive the auto sector is to the Germans. And it's sensitive in the sense that it would be a big blow.
Right.
A really big blow.
Right.
So yes, we want a trade deal, I think. And this is looking for leverage right now.
Sure.
Through these other tariffs to try to implement that trade deal at some point.
Well, sort of wind up our conversation on tariffs and trade agreements, we have a USMCA agreement that we actually worked out and negotiated. You know, so we finally have a peace accord, but now we've got to get it ratified. Mexico has already ratified it. Canada's waiting on us.
Yeah.
Our current political climate makes it very difficult to get anything done in Congress, but how important is it in your mind that we get ratification of the USMCA agreement?
It's really important to Texas. You know, I think the time when all of the studies were done, and I don't think this agreement really changes NAFTA all that much. So I think just in terms of the traffic that moves across the border and benefits Texas, we have the bridges. We're the linkage across the Rio Grande right into the rest of Mexico. But when NAFTA was originally signed, their big beneficiary was Mexico. The U.S., we got marginal, minimal benefit out of it one way or the other, but it was our chance to help a poor neighbor. Canada got some benefit, but for the U.S. it was, so, you know, didn't mean all that much. And I think that's remains in case. I think Mexico remains the big winner, the big winner that it was previously. So it's more important to them and to the stability of a relatively poor neighbor to the south of us. But to Texas, like I said, we have that linkage. We have the transportation that comes right up I-35 into the industrial heartland.
Right.
And those ties through the maquiladora system and the factory system, the big, huge auto plants that now ring the interior of Mexico.
Right.
And they're important to us. They're part of our supplier system now, part of the whole network that holds American manufacturing together.
Well, this has been just a tremendous insight into where we came from 2018 through today, and where we are going in 2020 and beyond. And it's as it is every time you and I get together, I'm always fascinated by what's around us and what things come into play with respect to our local and regional and national economies. And all of these things that we've been talking about are extremely critical for us as business people to stay in tune with and to be aware of, and to just, you know, keep our eyes open. It's almost like, wait a minute, aren't we in the longest expansion, U.S. expansion, economic expansion in U.S. history?
Ever, yeah.
And can't we just rest on that? Can't we just go with that?
Yeah. They don't die of old age, you know, as long as you don't kill them in the cradle.
As long as you don't kill
okay.
it. Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, Bill, thank you for doing this. Thank you for coming out and being with us again, and just giving us so much insight into some extremely important issues. And it's always fascinating. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And you know, the story always changes, so let's do it a third time.
Absolutely.